Thank you very much, William. Thank you for all the speakers here. And now it's time for the panel. So may I just ask Marianna and Evgenia, who are physically present in the venue, to join me back on the stage. And Ilmar and William, you are, of course, joining us virtually, and I can already confirm your presence here on the screen. So ladies, please take your seats. Kind reminder, you still have a chance to enter your questions using the Slido web app. I see many of you have already used this opportunity, and I will gladly ask the questions posted. Now, ladies, you made a wonderful overview of the success story of the Russian-speaking communication, government communication, but I would like to ask Ilmar, how would you characterize the real change of thinking in the government crisis communication that COVID brought?
Well, it seems to me that in government communication, or from the Stratcom side, there was no big change, because the crisis just offered the opportunity to do it the way it should be done according to theory. Especially that since we speak about government communication, then there are two things that are differentiated. One thing is government communication, the other is political communication. Government communication does not it speaks about state affairs, not political agendas. So now we had the crisis that potentially could bring the society together. And I think that by that moment in time, the government communication team had reached, by that moment, they had reached a higher level than what was normal 10 years ago. There were two things. One was that there was the readiness to also provide Russian language information, and to also conduct the surveys to see how it affects the community, Russian-speaking community. And in the past 5 years, Crisis Communication Center was set up, which was based on the understanding that during crisis, people are much more hungry for all kinds of information. And now they had the capacity to also meet the demand.
Ideas how to keep the connection, the good connection that you achieved between the government institutions or the government messaging and then the Russian-speaking audiences during times of peace, where we hopefully see no crisis in the future.
Well, first I would like to second Ilmar's comment that we work in government communications, but we're slightly different teams, and Stratcom unit is approximately 9 persons, and 1/3 of them are Russian speakers, which is a unique situation for government institutions, which is proportionate to our population. So I think Ilmar is here correct in the sense that we were lucky to be so in such situation in spring, so that we had the resources in-house, and some of the ministries had the resources in-house to invest in Russian-speaking communication more efficiently than was perhaps earlier. And one of the future links was mentioned during our presentation, and both me and Evgenia are working on this, is the intergovernmental roundtable that is aimed at coordinating both experts in analyzing target audience or analyzing how the communication should work, and both operative experts who are dealing with communication, so communication experts. Let's just hope that we use this window of opportunity wisely, and it's going to increase the common capability for Russian-speaking communication, not only in government office.
ma arvan, et väga positiivne.
I think it's also very positive that the entire public sector, and I believe maybe also the private sector, where earlier there was no daily need to communicate with the Russian-speaking population, or you could choose whether to communicate with them or not and to what degree, that this situation confirmed the fact that the readiness to receive, accept information, and this goodwill, positive attitude towards the messages conveyed when these messages have to do with the daily needs in Estonia, the daily challenges we face, that the population is willing to receive the messages, and the attitude towards information coming from the state is not as critical as we tend to think. So the readiness, the willingness is present, and like Marianne said before, in the situation when there is supply, then demand emerges as well. And actually, well, I used to work as a journalist, and I remember a similar situation when ETV2 was creating Russian language programs, and there was discussion, we don't have a host, so who will watch it? But when we started building it, then the people came. And now when we see how many new Russian-speaking journalists we have because of ETV Plus, that it confirms that when there is supply, then the community will also have the interest and demand.
It brings unexpected new challenges. Now, when you look at the preparedness of the public sector and the government sector in general, where do you still see room for improvement for those next potential crises that might be haunting us in the future? Marianne?
It is a big question. If we narrow it down to Russian-speaking communication, then of course one of the things to make sure that there is capability for communicate is to make sure that in all government institutions there's at least a landing page in Russian language, so that you have the platform where you can put essential information, be it press release or be it important public announcement. Unfortunately, currently, not all government institutions have it, but it is essential to cover it. Then it is clear understanding that having people who are native speakers is essential for doing efficient Russian-speaking communication. Just employing translation offices doesn't work. And simply translating Estonian messages into Russian language or into English language doesn't work efficiently as well, because there is cultural context, there is social economic context that impacts how the perception is working. And also Ilmar is speaking about, so the speakers who relay this message are significant. So we are now working on better mapping this situation in other institutions, and then let's see where we go from here.
Sama küsimus Ilmarile.
Same question to Ilmar as well.
It's very difficult to do much better than those people did this time. But I'm afraid that the crisis will be different, the next crisis. And then many of those assets that we have now won't work in the future. I mean that if we will have the polarizing issues, like the one Will was talking about, if we have ethnic conflict or racial conflicts or something like that, then we are back to the zero, and we need to find other ways.
Exactly, that's what I was trying to put my finger on, is that actually can we take lessons from this COVID crisis that are kind of universal in the next crisis? But yeah, a quick remark.
Maybe a lesson is to make special attention at different subgroups in society and to analyze the potential risk points. So I am now, for example, looking forward to integration monitoring that is done by Integration Foundation, that will be done this year. It will be extremely interesting to see the impacts that have been from current crisis on people's attitudes, on media consumption, etc., and to compare it to 2017 or 2015. I think understanding the importance of research and using research for both communication and decision-making on government level is essential. Ilmar has a...
Right, Ilmar, yeah, go ahead.
What I really mean, what's important is where now we had also, let's see if I...
Ilmar froze there for a second. Hopefully he will join us in a second. But while we wait and while Ilmar is coming back to us, I would like to bring William in this discussion also. William, you mentioned that the trust towards the UK government during COVID is sinking. It's rather low. What's driving criticism, well, besides the, of course, high rate of fatalities?
Well, I think that's the challenge that the government to know as well. I mean, I think part of it is indeed the number of cases. I think that that's part of the information that people on a regular basis we are seeing on national newscasts. We used to have daily press briefings, actually, like many countries did, where we were made very aware on a daily basis of how the number of cases, hospitalization, and mortalities, unfortunately, were rising. I think another aspect specific to the UK is the way that the government has handled, or perhaps not handled well, the issue of testing and tracing contacts. This is an issue that has gotten a lot of traction here in the UK. We have only recently we've learned of how university students will need to be tested and then sent home for the winter holidays. So I think there is a sense that the government has changed its mind several times, and that doesn't necessarily instill a lot of confidence in how the government is handling this. Now, just to link that to the previous point, which you were talking about, are there lessons here beyond COVID? I think one thing that comes out of not just my research using experiments and surveys, but also lots of other colleagues' work, is that information does potentially make a difference. So maybe that's one thing we can learn from here, that providing information, maybe on a surface level, can change to a small degree what people think and do in relation to a crisis, even on issues like immigration, which might be surprising for some people to hear. On the other hand, like what your other panelists mentioned, I think the way to take this forward is to focus on subgroups. It's to focus on for whom are these messages more or less effective. And I think that that's actually where we need more research, and that's where thinking about messaging strategies increasingly will be moving, they already are moving, in fact, towards a more tailored, contextually specific kind of approach.
As I see, Ilmar has joined us back on the screen. You had an idea that you wanted to finish. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to add that one of the very fragile points in the current government communication was that there were a huge debate inside the government, as this is quite normal, but sometimes those messages, there was different levels of communication. On one level, there was sometimes political, sometimes personal agendas that the ministers were talking to the public, and on the other level, there was this strategic communication team that was trying to do just a necessary, essential thing. And there were moments where all this created a cacophony or confusion. Although we had this quite a unifying crisis, but let's imagine that we will have a situation like in the United States right now, where there's one group who is saying that the elections were tricked, and the others are believing that they were not. And then what will do then the team of strategic communication?
Actually, there's a good point there, talking about the confusion that can occur sometimes on different levels of communication. When we look at, let's say, our neighbors, the Swedes, when I look at the limitations, the restrictions that are in place, there's not much of a difference, actually. No dramatic differences, at least, between Sweden and in Estonia. But when I look at how the Swedish model of communication, or let's say the impact that the Swedish government is trying to make on society, I would describe it in a way as empowering society. It's not like top-to-bottom communication, but giving the responsibility for the citizens. Now, what I sensed in Estonia is somewhat of a desire of the politicians, or even, let's say, one great leader to step on the podium and give orders to society from the political level. Now, I'm just wondering, how do you sense that? Why is that so in Estonia? Is it effective? Is it counterproductive? Have you tried to challenge that?
Well, I think if we speak about first, I will refer to what Ilmar has said earlier. There is political communication and there is government communication. And these, fortunately or unfortunately, are two completely different things, and there are different possibilities to control or impossibilities to control one or the other.
Are they disturbing each other?
I would like... I first
go ahead.
respond to your question. Yeah. So if we look at the strategy of public communication in spring, and I think Evgenia would perhaps add to this as well, is that a lot of Estonian communication was shaped in the form that we do. We stay at home. We follow the rules. So there was, we didn't follow the Swedish example in the sense of being different from all the world. So there were specific restrictions in decisions that were made, but in communication there was also a strong call for personal responsibility and personal behavior of people. But I would agree that perhaps we should learn more from the Swedish position and messaging, because indeed, as I was trying to show in the data, the most spread of COVID-19 currently is happening among younger people who are least in the zone of risk group. So since this challenge is a challenge for society as a whole, it can only be overcome as well in society as a whole. And in this case, Swedish have a very fair and good point, is that simply personal fear of this virus is not efficient in actually stopping the pandemic. The responsibility for weaker groups, for own or other elderly or chronically ill people, is what might work more.
Evgenia, go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, the more civil activity we have on the every level of our lives, the better. On the other hand, in spring and also now in autumn, we faced the challenge that different target groups and different regions can be more or less ready for independent activity. For example, in the end of the spring, government said that the next time that will be a local, we will solve the COVID problem on local level. But in the autumn, we saw that some regions can be more independent. They can invent different ways how to act. The local society can be more active, and on the other hand, there are regions where we have a clear expectation that government should solve the problem and go to the tiniest details to solve this problem. So I think that civil activity is a very good thing, but if some target groups and some people feel that they are not ready to this activity at the moment, we have also response to their expectations.
Okay, quick remark from Marianna.
Quick remark is that we have to be aware as well that if we compare Estonia and Sweden, we didn't start from the ground zero. The capability of civil society to, as Evgenia said, to take responsibility, or for regional governments to take responsibility in different regions now depends on their practice that existed until spring. So if in Sweden it is working now efficiently, we have to take into consideration the situation that our resources and our human and decision-making resources. And I would say that we could learn a lot from Swedish experience, and perhaps we just have to develop so that it would be possible easily next time.
I would like to get William on board here with something that Ilmar mentioned, this cacophony or confusion. I don't know if Ilmar exactly meant it, but what I was thinking during the moment Ilmar mentioned this confusion is, of course, the confusion with the face masks. It's been, let's say, the narrative has changed quite a bit. And William, I suspect this is also something that the politicians in the UK, or the government communication in the UK, is struggling with. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one because like many European countries, but particularly in the UK, we obviously don't have a tradition or a cultural norm around face mask wearing, right? And I think actually what we've seen in surveys since over the summer and since then is actually that public consent for and support for not just face mask wearing, but other kinds of public health related behaviors is actually quite high. And I think that that's actually possibly been one of the strengths of the UK government's messaging, where now I mean, aside from the fact that it's changed several times, but if you look at the original government communications coming out earlier in February, March, April, it was actually fairly consistent and it was fairly clear. Now, since then, we could have a debate about whether or not indeed we've had several U-turns or other kinds of changes that confuse, as Ilmar mentioned. But generally, if we look at public consent for these kinds of behaviors and practices, it's actually fairly high in the UK. And I think the challenge, though, and this links with the previous discussion about the role of government communication and where change happens. Does it happen top down or bottom up? I think that the challenge here is, how do you maintain, well, first of all, how do you build? And then how do you maintain public consent for these kinds of interventions? Right now, for example, we're in the middle of a second lockdown here in England, and the public consent for that is actually still fairly high. Over 60% of people support the idea of a lockdown, and the question going forward, again, using the analogy of a marathon, from the point of view of communication, is how do you maintain that, given that the situation is likely to change in fairly unpredictable ways, right? Over the next few months or even the following year. And it's that longer-term view of how do you maintain and build public support, it will probably be context dependent, whether it comes from top down. Let's say if we look at the study I mentioned earlier about public trust, the Australian Prime Minister actually is one of the few leaders over the summer who received positive evaluations from both members of his own party and members of the opposition, right? So it was actually a relatively unusual case of public consent kind of rallying around a leader. That's not to say that that will maintain, right? So I think the question here is, how do we mobilize different kinds of messengers that speak to the kinds of target audiences that we want? And to echo the point that was made earlier, this is not just about kind of, even though younger people might be the more likely to be spreading the virus, or we heard earlier that they want to be young people, right? And that's well and good, but remember that all sections of society have lost quite a bit, and I feel like it's important to recognize that communication, while it can be targeted, and it should be targeted, it has to be done in the service of serving society as a whole and taking that wider view.
Ilmar, who do you think should be doing the messaging in Estonia about the restrictions? Who would be the most effective person for, let's say, each community, the Estonian and the Russian-speaking community? And second, I would still like to clarify, when you mentioned cacophony and confusion, were you thinking about face masks?
Yes, the face masks were definitely one of the examples. If we remember that the March situation, where there were some political figures who said that they are completely useless, at the same time the experts level said that yes, we would like to go for a mask and so on. It was a moment of confusion in the sense that the average citizen could ask, so what would you advise then? Now, if you're asking who could give now the instructions, then it is true that it depends on the message and on the desired effect. For one part, if this is the current imposed law or regulation, then I think that this is absolutely okay if a government figure, a minister or prime minister, is giving that out. But then on the meaning creation level, where you explaining it, then this should be done inside the subgroups or target groups, where representatives of this particular target group is talking to his or her own community.
Well, one of the takeaways I got from Ilmar's keynote speech was that the Estonians haven't, luckily so far, really experienced the true pain of the crisis. We haven't seen hospitals being filled up with patients, like stuff that, I mean, when you look at the spring experience, what the New Yorkers had, I mean, we've been lucky. Now, does that create a threat that this wave that we're currently experiencing and the restrictions that the government has actually just agreed today will not be taken seriously by the auditorium? How worried are you about that? And do you have a communication strategy? I mean, we know that emotions can build up, can make communication more effective. So what's your plan to really get the messages out there?
Well, first of all, I would like to, okay, I don't have the English word for that, but kiita.
Praise.
Yes, I would like to praise the people of Estonia, because the experience of last week showed that if at the beginning of the week, I was really worried looking at the statistics from our public opinion surveys, so people's awareness of risk had decreased, but as soon as the numbers rose, then the difference was dramatic, and the support towards adding more restrictions was also 40% wanted to add, and like a bit below 50 were satisfied with existing restrictions. So currently Estonian public trusts the government in terms of restrictions enough, and so it gives us hope that this communication and resolution of the crisis will be positive, and I hope that this trust lasts. At the same time, you're correct, we have not seen, for us, the horrors of COVID remain abstract. In social media, there are talks about, well, have you personally seen anybody who has COVID? Now, as the numbers have risen, there are more personal experiences, but most certainly this may have an impact, and it may have such an impact that people become more strict in their behaviors later, and we will have to pay with numbers for that, like even if we become aware. So now about the strategy, we have this in mind, and we are thinking of how to reach with these messages. So perhaps Evgenia also
yes, I would
wants
like
to add.
also to add that the main message of our social campaign now it's let's be careful but keep Estonia open. Let's keep our theaters, cinemas, workplaces, and so on open, because in the beginning of autumn, we clearly could see that people were very afraid of the fact that their lives will stop again. And now it's very important to find a clear balance between the restrictions, the need to be careful, and on the other hand, the need to be open and to go on with people's lives.
William, you wanted to comment that?
Yeah, I wanted to hear because I think that your question about what can Estonia learn, and I admit, first of all, that I'm not obviously intimately familiar with the Estonian context, but it does strike to me you are in a unique position in that because you are you haven't seen this or personally experienced it as a country in the same way as, say, Spain, France, the UK, the United States have experienced with those horrific images, right? And what strikes to me is that in a way I'm not surprised to hear of your recent survey results, for example, that show public support for these kinds of measures increased, right, upon learning of these increases in cases. And the kinds of surveys and experiments that I've done here in the UK suggest that people do indeed respond to that kind of information about the numbers of mortalities and cumulative case counts. But crucially, that kind of information isn't enough to sustain public support, right? It's in connection with other ways of communicating, which very well might be, for example, personal stories or narrative. We could draw a parallel here to linking it to issues of diversity in immigration, where, at least in the UK and across many countries actually, most people don't have direct contact with asylum seekers, refugees, or immigrants. And so they rely on other forms of information to help fill in that kind of experience. And the research in that kind of area shows that these kinds of personal stories and narratives tend to work in a different way, possibly even more effectively than the kind of numbers and statistics that you might hear from censuses or official surveys and things like that. But actually, it might be the combination of the two that is also effective for some parts of the population. So bringing it back to COVID, I think that here, again, thinking it for the Estonian context, you have a real opportunity here to really maintain and build public support for the kinds of interventions that have gone into force. And I would encourage you to think and learn from perhaps the experiences of other European countries that didn't have that luxury of time. and learning.
Thank you, William. We have 6 minutes before we head to coffee, so a quick comment, and then I have a few questions from the audience I
Sure.
definitely want to ask.
Just a comment also, behind this strategy of balance, there's also awareness that COVID-19 has strong effects on people's stress levels and mental health. So lockdowns or restrictions or even like repeating communication of death and restrictions may have negative effect on people's mental health. And Estonia, as it is entering the period of darkness of our climate. So in front of us are several months when the daylight is going to be short. So this is also one of the points that we have to have in mind. So people, please wear masks so that we don't have to lock down more.
Well, that's loud and clear. 2 questions from the audience which I would like to combine. Did the surveys only cover citizens of Estonia or also non-citizens and migrants? And how did the people in Estonia who don't speak Estonian, English or Russian get the crisis information? And was that a topic that was also discussed in your department?
The survey covered all population of Estonia, disregarding their language or citizenship, etc. So I would have to say that the data was more representative for Estonians and Russian-speaking minorities, but the English-speaking new migrants, etc., they just don't come up in this population service, usually in large enough numbers. So the Ministry of Interior has done research with this target group during the summer as well to look at their feedback on government communication regarding crisis. And communication in kris.ee was available in all 3 languages from the week 1 of emergency situation, in Estonian, Russian and English language. And up until now there are 24/7 translators working, so that as soon as new information is published in Estonian, usually it's a matter of hours when this information will be available in Russian and English as well.
How do you keep this positive momentum of increased following of the Estonian channels, Evgenia? This is a question from the audience.
Yes, actually, we hope that one of the long-term impacts of this crisis will be that this state helpline 1247 will work also in the future, also in the less stressful time as a official information helpline. And also the questions and answers we have now at the kris.ee site will be developed in the official information line. But I can also maybe add to the previous discussions that another one big challenge now is that to make a difference between most important messages and background information and consulting, because it's important to keep main messages simple and clear, but the everyday life is much more complicated, and we have to guarantee that people who have complicated situation in everyday life, they also could get an information and help from the officials to solve the problems, because if we have only simple messages, they will not help to solve the everyday problems of people, and it's one of the biggest challenges now actually.
Ilmar, do you think the momentum we saw during the pandemic could also translate to a bigger follower, a stable follower base for the Russian-speaking media in Estonia when we think about ETV Plus, for instance, and its competitive situation in Estonia?
Yes, but we need to differentiate. There are 2 levels of viewership. One is that during the crisis, there are always more viewers than on the normal times. So it doesn't mean that exactly the same numbers that we had on the peak of crisis will stay there. At the same time, in the media history, there are many stories of media outlets who became big with the crisis and then stayed for a long time, like CNN and the first Gulf War that made CNN an international star, and then it stayed for quite many years, let's say. In the same way, I think that the ETV Plus has increased the number of its viewers considerably, but to have more viewers that it does have right now, it is difficult also because at the same time we observe the fragmentation of the audience, we observe how there is a migration from television to internet, and at the same time transformation of the television. So there is no clear answer.
Thank you, Ilmar. I'm going to steal 1 minute from Kofi. I hope you do apologize or forgive me for that. But one last question. As William was saying, the attitudes towards migrants in the UK could potentially change because of COVID, because people just understood that those people, even if they have a migratory background, are just so important for the country. Now, I'm not sure if that's the case in Estonia, because we're mostly exporting nurses and doctors, not importing them. But do you see a positive takeaway, a positive change in society that COVID has brought?
Is your question about the migrants or
in general, let's say in the
general.
cohesion of the Estonian society and integration, as that is obviously the topic of this conference?
I think there is a positive, well, first of all, we have spoken about the need for communication, and that's a clear positive takeaway. Another clear positive takeaway was the response of Russian speakers who, if during first weeks there were concerns that there's going to be such a huge problem or situation for how much Russian speakers are informed or not, but it was overcome in mere weeks. So understanding that it doesn't matter what language people are speaking, but that they are part of the same information space, and they're making an effort to be a part of the same information space. That's a clear message that needs to be remembered for future as well, because it has a tremendous impact on how this information space is built up during normal times outside of the crisis. And that's what we have to repeat and repeat and repeat for different institutions, and hopefully it's going to take roots.
Dear panel, thank you so much for this interesting discussion. Plenty of food for thought here.
Yeah.
And applause for the panel, I think.